and then you're going to want to okay, you're okay. Hi guys, welcome to Electric Bike Laboratory. I'm Samil, and today we're going to be building a 14S 5P battery in a down tube DP6 case. We're going to be using 18650 cells and a Dali 14S 30 amp BMS, pre-cut nickel pieces that will connect the groups of cells together. Okay, so the first step is to lay out your cells in a 14S 5P pattern. So that means 14 in series, 5 in parallel. So we're going to start with the positive on this end facing up. So we're going to put 5 cells in a group facing up. So the next step would be to put the other side of the cell holder on. It could be a little tight, so don't be scared to smack it down a little bit, or Windex could help slide the cell holder in. We're going to be using custom manufactured nickel plates which are 0.2 thick, but you can use regular nickel strips. That's perfectly fine also. This will go on the positive terminal, which will be isolated 5 cells. This piece will go on the negative terminal, which will also be isolated. And then we're going to be using these pre-cut nickel, these pieces, to connect the rest of the groups. So this group will connect to that group, and then you're going to repeat until the end, and then you're going to have your positive and negative terminals isolated. So that's what your first side is going to look like once it's laid out. And then you will spot weld this side, and then you will flip the pack over and then lay out the nickel on the other side. So since we isolated the positive and the negative terminals on the other side, on this side we're going to connect all the groups together. Okay, so a good step to do before you spot weld the whole pack together is make sure that all the cells are within the same voltage, around the same. So I'm using a multimeter here and I'm going over each cell. So when you're checking for the voltage of each cell, they should be basically around the same volt. So right now I'm checking the cells and I'm getting around 2.95 for each cell, or really close to that. These two groups are going to get connected, and then you're going to repeat again to the end. So these 5 cells and these 5 cells. So this is what your other side is going to look like on your pack. So once you have all your nickel laid out, the next thing you want to do is spot weld them down to each cell. We usually use a K-weld around 40 joules per each cell to make sure there's a good weld on it and it won't come loose. So depending on the capacity of the cells you use, you can either get a 15 amp hour, 16 amp hour, or a 17.5 amp hour pack. So if you use a 3 amp hour cells, you can get a 15 amp hour pack, that's 3 times 5 in parallel. Or if you use 3.2 amp hour cells, you can get 16 amp hour pack. Or if you use 3.5 amp hour cells, you can get 17.5 amp hours in your pack. So we like to have tabs on each of the groups, so it's easy to put the balance leads on each group in a sort of neat and organized way. The next step is to sort of cover and insulate the whole pack with heat resistant tape, or this is called Kapton tape. That's a brand of the tape. It's very high heat resistance, so the pack will be safe and you won't accidentally cross 2 of the groups together and arc them when you're doing the rest of the pack. So what I'm going to do is, first I'm going to lift off these tabs and then sort of run Kapton around the pack and cover it up. But for now I'm going to leave the positive terminal exposed because I do need to solder onto the positive terminal. But the negative terminal has a nice big tab that we can directly put the battery negative wire on. As you can see, I've put Kapton or heat insulation tape all around the battery, but as I said, I'm going to leave the positive terminal exposed so I can put some solder points on there so I can put the positive wire on there and then cover it on with Kapton afterwards. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to scratch each of the tabs and then put dabs of solder on it so I can put these balance leads run into each of the groups. Put more solder on this battery negative tab so the battery negative wire can solder on there and it can carry more current than the other tabs. The last thing I will do is I will put solder points on the positive terminal as well as a little solder point for the positive balance lead, and then we can put the positive wire on the end. Okay, so I've put solder points on each of the balance tabs on each group. And like I said, I put 3 solder points on the positive terminal so the battery positive wire can solder on. And then I put a little tiny solder point for the positive balance lead to go on. Okay, so once I've covered the positive terminal, I'll use little snippers to expose just the solder points so you can solder onto them. So as you can see, this BMS has 3 screws at the back, and when we lay it on top of our pack, there is a chance that it could dig into the cells and cause them to arc. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this insulating fish paper on the back of it so it protects the BMS and the cells from connecting together. So the next step would be lining up where the BMS is going to go. So on this DP6 case, the only place the BMS can really go without interfering the lid is on the side here. But one thing we have to do is mark where the posts are going to go and then avoid the posts as well as this little tab, and then sort of put the BMS right in the middle, and then we're going to run the balance leads up and over. So I'm going to grab a marker and then sort of mark where the posts are like this. And then I'm going to mark where this tab is. And then as long as you avoid the post and the tab and then kind of put the BMS right around here, you should be good. And then you want to leave enough space, so kind of put the BMS to the back where the leads can run up, as well as the power negative and the battery negative wire can run up like that. Okay, so I'm gonna put the BMS over here, and then I'm gonna see where my wires on the BMS can run. So they can run up this way, and then you want to avoid any tabs, so you don't want to run the wires directly on top of tabs because that's where the balance leads are gonna go. So you can put the BMS down sort of like this, and then see where the leads will also run up this way, and then you can glue the BMS onto the side of the battery. And it's okay to glue the BMS on the side of the battery because we did put a insulating fish paper in between the cells and the BMS, so there would be no chance of the BMS arcing with the cells. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run the temperature sensor into the cells. You can't run it on top of the insulating tape because it won't detect when it gets hot. So what you want to do is make a little slit and then put the temperature sensor in there and put a little bit of glue to hold it in there. Okay, so once the temperature sensor is in through the insulating tape, you can put some more insulating tape on top and then run the balance leads on top of that. Okay, so the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to solder on this battery negative wire to the negative terminal of the battery. As you can see, it is a little short, so I'm going to need to extend it about 4 inches here or 3 inches, and then get it on the battery negative terminal. So you can use a tape and then measure how long the extension needs to be, and then solder it onto this battery negative wire. This is a 14 gauge wire, so I'm going to take a 14 gauge wire, extend it, and then solder it on. I run this battery negative wire and the power negative wire up. I always like to put insulating fish paper under any wires that run on top of the cells just for safety, so I think that's a good step. So another thing I like to do is put another layer of insulating fish paper on top of the cells where the balance leads will be running, and also your power negative and battery negative wire will be running, just for safety. Okay, so the next step is to solder on the battery negative wire, which we extended, and then solder it onto the battery negative tab right here. Okay, so now that I got the battery negative wire on, I'm not going to quite glue it down or tape it down yet because I still need to run all the balance leads down. So what I will do is I will run the balance leads, solder them on, and then at the end I will put this wire down and insulate, put an insulating layer of tape in between, and then put the wire down. So this is double-sided sticky tape. Putting this down so the balance leads can stick on and go up. It's neater than using glue, so it will be less messy. So remember, when you're running the balance leads up, you don't want to run them past the post. You have your post here, which we marked, so you want to sort of curve them upwards and then run them up. So one thing I also want to look out for is this tab here. So what I will do is I will run half the leads on this side of the tab and the other half on that side, and just avoid that tab. So I will put a couple layers of double-sided sticky tape on top to run the balance leads. So if you are running your balance leads up like this, what you want to make sure is that you're not crossing over two leads. You want to make sure they're separated, as I did here, so when you do put on the leads on top, they won't get crisscrossed or go on the wrong group. So to put on your balance leads on each group, you're going to start with your negative balance lead, which is going to go around and solder onto your negative group, and then the next lead is going to go over to the group on the other side, and then you're going to keep alternating throughout the groups and solder each balance lead on until you get to your positive, and the last lead will go on your positive terminal. As you can see, this wire is going to cross over your first wire. So anytime one balance lead crosses over another, what you want to do is either put insulating tape or insulating paper to make sure that there is no chance of them arcing together. It's just for safety. So your last four wires are going to run this way. So what I will do, since they're going to run over top of these wires, what I will do is put insulating Kapton tape and then more double-sided sticky tape, and then run them over this way. Okay, so now we're at our last lead here, and one way to check if you've done all your leads correct is that your last lead should be going to your positive terminal. As you can see, I've put all the balance leads on to each of the groups, starting with the negative and the second lead going there, third, fourth, and so on, alternating on each side. And then the last lead will go on your positive group. And as you can see, I didn't run any balance leads directly on top of each other. There's always insulating tape underneath wherever they're crossing. Okay, so after all the balance leads are on each group, you want to check if they went to the right group. So one way to do it is we have an active balancer which we can plug in and then check with the phone app. But if you do not have an active balancer, you can just use a multimeter and then sort of probe each group one after another, and then see that they're increasing by about 2.9 volts. So 2.9, 5.8, 8.7, 11.69, and so on. And then you should, so we're getting about 41 volts across all the groups, which is good. That's 2.9 times 14. So the next step would be assembling the base and prepping it for the battery to go on. So the kit comes with a switch, a charge port, a cover for the charge port, a nut, and a button for the indicator. And if your DP6 kit does not come with an indicator, you can purchase a 52 volt indicator for these Reention DP6 cases. So when you put the cover on the charge port and you put the charge port in, you want to make sure that the top of the cover aligns with that slit right there, and then you can put your nut in and then tighten the charge port. You don't need an exact wrench to tighten that on. You can just use like snippers and make sure it's on there good. Twist that on. Okay. After that, you're going to want to put your switch in, and then when you put the switch in, can go either direction. I like to have the on side on the right side, and then you just click the switch in. Get a click. Okay. I'm going to put the indicator button in this slot, like that. And then while the button is in, you want to get your LED indicator and make sure it's a 52 volt because we're using a 52 volt battery. And you want to slide that in there like that. And then that is good to go. Okay, so the next step would be to run your charge wires. So I'm gonna snip off these little tabs in between the posts so you can tuck the charge wires in there nicely so it won't get in the way of anything. So you can use little snippers like this and then carefully break it off without damaging the post. When it comes to your charge port, that leg right there is your positive leg, and the leg on the left is your negative, and the one in the middle does not get used. So what I like to do is I like to just snip it off and then break it off so you don't get confused. And then once again, right side positive with that little tab, and then left side negative. So on this base, the positive, number 3 and number 2, those 3 pins are going to be used for your positive, and then 1 and negative, those are going to be used for your negative. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scratch each of these pins, put flux, and then put solder on them. So pre-solder them so the wires can stick on easy. And then same thing with our charge port. I'm going to scratch, put flux, and pre-solder that, as well as the switch port. So when you're soldering on the charge port and the switch, you don't want to hold the solder on there too long because the pins are a little fragile, especially on the switch port. If you put too much solder in, there is a chance this switch could short. So just be careful to just put a little dab of solder. So now I'm going to be putting the indicator wires on. So the positive wire will go on the most left leg of the positive, and then the negative wire can go right on to the right pin on the negative. Putting the positive wire down, I like to glue it down so it stays in place, and then I like to put the negative and then also glue that down. So the glue will also help sort of separate the negative indicator and the positive indicator wire from coming into contact with each other. Since our BMS is a common port BMS, it gets charged through and discharged through the same terminal. So the charge wire and the discharge wire can both go on the pins, But in case your BMS has a different charge port and a discharge port, what you want to do is run this negative discharge wire directly to your BMS charge port. And same thing, if your BMS also has a different charge for positive, you want to run it right to the BMS. But in our case, our BMS is a common port, so we can have the discharge and the charge through the pins. The length of the positive charge wire is about 12.5 inches to run it from this pin, tuck it in all the way to the positive leg of the charge port. And then the negative wire, what I do is I solder it on here, then I run it around all the way to the negative pin. So that's about 15 inches. And then the positive discharge wire will go on these 3 pins and then solder onto the battery. So that's about 4 inches, which is what I measured. And then here I'm measuring the negative discharge wire, how long it needs to be. So I measured it to be about 9 inches to connect to the power negative wire on the BMS from the pins. What I also do is I put 2 pieces of little shrink over the charge port legs to protect them and make sure they won't come into contact with anything else or each other. And then also I glue over the charge port to make sure it really stays in place and to protect the exposed part of the positive leg. And then each of the charge wires you can tuck in between the post where you made the little snip. And the positive charge wire, you want to sort of fold it and then glue that there so it won't get scraped by the battery coming into contact with it, and then fold it over, tuck it in. And then you can also shoot little dabs of glue where the charge wires are tucked in to hold it in place. After that, I'm going to connect the charge wires as well as the discharge wires onto the pins. So the positive charge wire can go on the positive leftmost pin, and then you want to put your discharge wire across the left 3 pins, and then your negative charge wire can go on the most right negative pin, and then the negative discharge shares the most right 2 pins. So you can use blue snippers to hold down the discharge wires to press it down onto the pins. You don't want to press down with your soldering iron, it could break. Okay, so you want to check that you got your positive discharge wire across all the 3 pins, and then your positive charge wire as well as your indicator wire. You want to make sure they're on good, give it a tug, make sure it's not coming off. And then you want to also check the same for your negative charge, discharge, and indicator, and give it a tug and make sure it's not coming loose. After you do that, you can cover it with glue to protect it, because if these 2 ports come into contact, it will arc and that could be dangerous. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover it up with glue. Okay, after you do that, your base prep is done, and then you can get your battery on and then solder the rest of the wires on. The positive charge wire, I glue it on here because this is where the post of the lid will go, and you don't want it to crush that wire. So you want to press it right up against this lock and then glue it on. So one more thing I like to do is before I run any of the wires on top of the balance leads, I like to cover it up with fish paper, fish insulation paper, so they won't come into contact with the balance leads at all. Okay, so the next step would be to put your battery onto the base like this, and then you're going to connect your power negative wire with the negative wire from the pins and solder connect it, and then the positive wire here, you're going to strip it and then solder across those 3 points. Always remember to put shrink beforehand before you solder wires together, and then run it over and heat it. Next, I'm going to be gluing down the wires by avoiding the post, and then glue over the positive and make sure everything is sealed and tucked nicely. Okay, so I ran the switch wires and I put insulating tape underneath them and between the wires, and then I'm going to run it over this way and then solder it on. Okay, so I have put fish paper or fish insulating paper on the sides of the battery, so when the lid goes on it won't scratch over anything and everything is protected. So the last step would be to put the lid on and then screw it on. So here we have it, guys, a 14S5P or a 52 volt 15 amp hour battery in our case here, and it's inside the case, the lid is on, the screws are on, and that is completed. If you have any questions or thoughts, make sure to drop a comment and let us know if you want to see any other battery builds in the future, and we'll see you next time, and stay tuned.